Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is John. I am a former Thinkful student and now webinar host. Now let's get started. And for you guys that don't know anything about Thinkful, I have a little description of it on the screen. It's a tech bootcamp equipping people with the education and network to launch new careers and to take place in the world's next workforce. So yeah, this is a huge deal here. The two real main things that Thinkful does offer is the one-on-one mentorship and the project-based learning. So what the one-on-one mentorship does is it basically allows you to speak to pretty much like a senior developer or a senior data scientist, a senior designer, whatever course you take. And that person is basically tasked with, being your personal tutor. So this is, pretty essential. I mean, like, how many of you guys have sat in a classroom with 20 to 30 people trying to get the teacher's attention, but kind of falling short? Whereas if you have a one-on-one mentor, it does kind of help your case a little bit quicker. The other thing is the project-based learning. My next question to you guys is, how many of you have a GitHub account or have ever heard of GitHub? GitHub is a really popular cloud software feature in the development community. And again, if you don't have any GitHub account or anything like that, that's totally fine. But basically, what Thinkful allows you to do is, take your GitHub account from basically, absolutely nothing to something that is worthy of, job seekers and things like that. So for those of you who don't know what GitHub is, it's basically a place online where you could put your projects. So think of it as kind of like, your coding projects would be a supplement to your resume, basically, so that when you apply to a job, for example, not only would they be looking at your resume, but they would also want to see what kinds of projects you've been working on. So that's where GitHub comes in. There are other programs as well, like Bitbucket, but GitHub is really like the big one on the block these days. The last thing is that this is guaranteed. So if you end up not getting a job after 6 months of graduating, then your money is returned to you. This is, a testament to how seriously our career services team really takes their job seriously. They want to get you a job. That is basically what Thinkful is here for. And if we are not getting you that sought after job, then we have not done our job, basically. All right, so just keep that in mind. And with that said, we are going to move forward into the JavaScript webinar, Building a Pet. All right, so looks like we have a pretty diverse amount of people in the chat here in terms of how much experience you guys have. I've seen some people with no experience, some people with some experience, some people that are transitioning from other languages, which is cool. I also just put a poll out. If you guys want to answer that, that's totally cool. But you guys already kind of answered it, so it's not a big deal. But basically, this is what we are going to be making. It's a very simple application. It's basically just a puppy, and depending on which button you click, obviously this won't work because this is not the actual application, but depending on which button you click, different things will happen. So for example, if you play with your puppy, the happiness will go up. And if you exercise with your puppy, the weight will go down. So something like that. It's pretty standard, but it does use a bit of JavaScript logic, or just logic in general, where, this is the kind of thinking that you kind of have to do to be, a pretty good developer and whatnot. And these are things that you really always have to keep in mind when you are making applications like this. So for example, before we even start this application, we may start to think, what exactly what kinds of functions or variables would we have to need in order to create something like this? And if you don't know what a function or variable is, don't worry, because we will get to that part. But for those of you that do know what a function or variable is, then just keep those things in the back of your mind as we move through. All right, so here's a bit of the starter code. You guys can look at this. We will take a look at this, but obviously I don't want to start with this part just because we should just do a little bit of a JavaScript overview first. but basically I will click on this, and we'll basically go through exactly what is in all the folders and things like that. First thing is that this is a website called Glitch. And what Glitch is it's basically a website where you can put projects online, sort of like that GitHub thing I was mentioning before. But here I could actually work the code right from the browser, which is really cool. And I could run code right from the browser. And you could also see, like, other people can be in as you are coding, for example. So you could kind of collaborate and things like that. But basically, this is Glitch. Another thing about Glitch is there are different folders. So for example, this is kind of like what a JavaScript project would look like. You will have sort of like a server.js file. There's a CSS file here. There's an HTML file. So we will go through one by one what all of these things mean at the moment. I just wanted to give you an overview of what Glitch looks like. And the last thing is, if you wanted to actually see the app, you just have to click here where it says show. And then let's open this in a new window. And this is our application. All right, so it's a pretty standard application, kind of like the one that we've seen before, only we have a much more interesting picture of this dog here. And obviously this is the starter code, so nothing is going to work. But if it were working, then ideally if I were to press one of these buttons, like right now I'm pressing these, but nothing's happening. But ideally, if I were to press one of these buttons, something would happen to the weight or the happiness, depending on how I set up the logic. Also, it would be nice to have a name here. So we do not have a name for this puppy right now. All right, so all things to keep in mind as we go through building. So just keep those things in mind as we move forward. All right. So before we get back to the puppy and creating the logic and things like that, I did mention that the most important thing to do is to figure out how exactly JavaScript works. Especially for you guys that are very new to JavaScript. The first section that we're going to talk about is what a variable is. And if any of you guys know what a variable is, either from from another coding language or based off of the English language, I guess, if you want to use kind of like the common term, what exactly a variable is. When I have to consider a variable, I think the best way to kind of understand what a variable is to just imagine. Basically, just imagine a cardboard box. To be honest, I think that is really kind of like the best definition of what a variable is, because it's basically a container that can hold stuff inside of it. Cody S. Did mention that it is something that holds, and that's exactly it. It is basically a placeholder. It's something that is a way of holding a particular value inside of it. So, for example, an example of a variable could be a name, like the name of. So, for example, in Facebook, there could be a variable for username, and that username is going to be different for every user. But at the same time, it is basically just the thing that the thing that is this container that is holding this name, sort of thing. So another way of thinking about a variable is I like to think of it as a sort of a noun. So for example, when you fill out a form, for example, you always have to fill out your name, your age, your date of birth, all this good stuff. And all of these things are basically going to go into the system, and all of these variables are going to be filled out with the values that you give them. So then from then on, your age is going to be 92 or 23 or whatever your age is. All right, so if we look on the screen here, we have a very, very standard variable here. So basically, there are three parts to your standard declaration of a variable. A variable, in order to use it, you basically have to initialize it, and you have to basically declare something. So in order to declare a variable, you're going to use a word like let's, like we have here on the screen. Let's is basically a way of telling your coding browser or your computer. It's basically telling the computer that, hey, guess what? I'm about to create something called a variable. All right, so let is probably the best way to do this these days. There are other ways of doing this. So for example, you could use the term var. If you look at a lot of documentation from a couple of years ago, a lot of it is going to say var. For tonight's sake, using var and using let, it's pretty much exactly the same. The only difference being that variables do react a little bit differently in terms of when they're placed inside of functions and things like that. But for our sake, let and var are pretty much the same thing. So basically, when you say let, you have to also name your variable. So what's going to happen then is you have to put a little space, and then you're going to name your variable. Here, our name is first variable. This is a perfectly fine name, although it's not very descriptive. I think usually when you name your variables, you want to be pretty descriptive as to what that variable is going to do. So for example, if you know that your variable is going to be the username of some application, then your variable should probably be something like let username. So it should be let username equal blank or something like that. All right, so just keep that in mind. Obviously first variable is just for this demonstration, but just keep that in mind in terms of when you end up naming variables and whatnot. Another thing about this is that this variable is starting with a lowercase f, and then the next word is starting with an uppercase v. This is what's known as camel casing. And what camel casing is it's basically, as you can see, like variables start with lowercase letters, and then every other new word is going to have an uppercase letter. This is the standard. You don't really have to do this. In fact, like your code will run if you don't do camel casing. However, coding is very much a team sport. So when I say that, I basically mean that, like, when you write code, there are going to be other developers on your team that are going to look at your code, and they're going to try to make sense of your code because they're going to have to build things on top of your code. So I will say that get used to writing camel case. It's not that difficult. It's basically just lowercase and an uppercase when there's a new word. But basically, there is if you capitalize the first, like if I were to capitalize this F, it would mean something a little bit different than the lowercase f. Uppercase variables are a little bit of a different animal, so we'll try to keep it camel case for now on for tonight's purposes. And the last, and also there's no spaces, because once you make a space, then the variable is over. All right, so keep that in mind. You can't start variables with numbers as well. They have to start with either a letter or an underscore. And but you can have a number inside of it. That's totally fine. All right, so that's a variable. The last thing is, and this part is totally option when it comes to JavaScript, you have to set the variable equal to something. Now, you could just end it let first variable, and that's it. Maybe put a semicolon at the end. But it makes a little bit more sense in our case to set the variable equal to something. If you don't set it equal to something, you won't get any sort of error, but you will get that the particular variable is undefined. All right, so it's slightly different, but it's just good practice. All right, awesome. Okay, so now we're going to move on a little bit, and let's see. What we're going to do is, if you are looking at the slides and you click into them, and I'm going into this thing called CodePen. And what CodePen is basically, it's a way that you can write variables right in the browser. In fact, if I were to go to codepen.io, see the site up here, codepen.io, this is the main page here. You could kind of scroll down and you could see other people's work. This is what other people have built by just using CodePen. In fact, if I were to click into one of these things, like for example, this vacation to-do list, This is a very awesome app. And you can see you could make checks, you could throw stuff out. It's a pretty cool to-do app. On the left side, you could actually see the code that is making this run. So you could see all of the HTML here on the top. You could see all of the CSS here in the middle. And that is weird that is, my screen is being collapsed a little bit, but that's okay. And you can see the JavaScript down here. So it's a pretty cool app, I would definitely say. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this CodePen.io to create our own little JavaScript applications. So what I'm going to do is I'm back on CodePen.io, the main page. And I'm going to click right up here where it says Start Coding, where this rainbow bordered box is. All right, so let me click into there. And now, as you can see on my screen, I have these three boxes, right? So I have the HTML box, I have a CSS box, and I have a JavaScript box. Now, this is basically where we could write all of our code. We could actually make an entire website from here, just as you saw with the to-do list. We can do HTML and CSS, although we won't be doing those today. We're only going to be focusing on JavaScript. Just a note that you can do other things with CodePen as well. You could give this a name. You could sign up or log in. You can change the view. So for example, if I wanted my setup to look like this or like this, I can also do that. And you can also add things. JavaScript by itself is a really awesome language, but at the same time, JavaScript also has these really cool things called libraries. And what libraries do is they make it basically easier to use JavaScript as a whole. So some really popular libraries these days are things like React or Node. I guess Node not technically a library, but that's okay. Vue is another good one. And what these are basically used for is, there's different things that these libraries are supposed to do. So for example, some libraries are good for making blogs, or some libraries are good for making pretty colors or whatever it is. But basically, if I go to the settings section here, I could either click on one of these three. So if I go to JavaScript, I am able to add in a library. So here we have jQuery, that's a library, Lodash, React, Angular, Vue, Ember. These are all different libraries. And all you have to do is really just search for them and click them. But at this point in time, we don't really need a library, but just know that you can do that, which is pretty cool. All right, so let me know if you guys have any questions, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag my JavaScript all the way up so that you guys can see the JavaScript that I'm going to write. And all I really want to do is basically just write a variable, right? So we saw a variable a little bit before, and the variable was let's do something like my name. So let my name equal John. All right, so this is a very standard way of writing a variable. We have the let's, we have the name of the variable, which in this case is my name, and we are setting it equal to something, right? So this is a very easy way to make a variable. Obviously on the screen, we don't see anything though. And the reason for this is that JavaScript doesn't automatically display to the screen. JavaScript is used for powering websites and things like that. But the thing that really is focused on putting things on the screen quickly is really HTML. So if I do something like this, let my name equal John, it's not going to show me my variable. In order to do that, I have to do a little bit of code to get it on the screen. And I will talk about how I'm doing this in a little bit, but basically what I have to do is say console.log, and in here I basically just have to put my variable name. So console.log my name, and then I'm going to come to the bottom of the screen where it says console, and I'm going to bring my console up like this. And I guess these reference errors happened before I was done writing the line, but basically you can see that now it's displaying the variable that I wanted to write. All right, so it's a very easy way of getting information. In fact, you don't have to just put variables here. For example, I could put console.log hello, and you can see now it says John and hello. So it's a that's console.log is a what's called a method in JavaScript. And it's basically just a version of a function, which we have not talked about yet. But basically, a function is something that does something. All right. So just a little bit about variables. Another thing that we can do is another way that we could write a variable, as I mentioned before, is var. So for example, I could say var my pet equals, and I'm going to call my pet Spot. All right. All right, this is extra fast. All right, so now we have my pet is equal to Spot. And lastly, just to give you a little bit of a difference, let's say age equal, let's say 55. All right, so just something to note here is that when I did write the number 55, you'll notice that the number 55 is actually more of an orangish color instead of the standard green that we're seeing. So the reason for that is that 55 is a number, right? JavaScript has very many different data types. It looks like Dan in the chat actually mentioned that a variable could be a number or a string. And this is very true. In fact, a variable can be a total of 7 different things. There are 7 different data types, 2 of which are on the screen right now. We have the things here wrapped in exclamation in quotation marks are what's known as a string, and strings are basically blocks of text. If I were to get rid of those quotation marks, then the variable would not work because blocks of text need to be written within a quotation marks. These quotation marks could be 2 quotes or 1 quote, but they just have to have quotation marks around them. All right, another data type is the number, as you can see here. My age is 55, although I feel a lot younger than I actually am, it looks like. 55 is, as it sounds, it's a number. I will note that a couple other coding languages have different types of numbers. So for example, there are things called integers versus floats. Floats are basically numbers that have decimals and things like that. JavaScript, it doesn't really work like that. In JavaScript, everything is pretty much a number. If there is like a numerical value, whether it be like a negative number or a decimal number, it doesn't really matter in JavaScript. Everything is just a number. All right, so those are just 2 of the data types that we have. There are others, like for example, the Boolean, if you want a true or false value. There is undefined, there is null, and objects and things like that. But just know that the string and the number are just 2 types of data types in JavaScript. All right, awesome. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch the second part of this video, please click the link below in the description. Hopefully you learned something today. I hope to see you back at another one of our Thinkful webinars soon.